All right, welcome back, Chelsea fans, to another episode of the London is Blue podcast. That is right. It is the summer transfer window, which means that we have to get one of our journalist friends on every single week to talk about all of the nonsense that is going on in the market and nonsense there is, but also good sense in a way for Chelsea Football Club. Welcome back to the show, Ben Jacobs. How are you doing?
Great to be here. Love your shirt as well. That yellow trim on the shoulders suits you.
Look, I'll tell you, my buddy Caleb sent me a bunch of his very kindly used vintage shirts. This one I had not have. It's the long sleeve too, which I'm like, I just love. I love a long sleeve shirt. So shout out to Caleb for being very, very kind. Look, Ben, we woke up on Monday morning and it was what I'm referring to kindly as deal bonanza for sure. But first, before we dive into some of that, I think the last time we talked was after Chelsea lost to Flamengo on the pod. At least we've talked plenty since, and the vibes were much different than where we've kind of ended the summer here as we head into the start of the season. How are you? How was the Club World Cup for you? And then how are you feeling about Chelsea now compared to then?
Yeah, I was never that panicked for them just because they lost to Flamengo. But what we saw was the system in particular get better and better with every game. People will forget because they beat PSG and destroyed PSG in many ways that actually the first 45 minutes against Benfica in that weather effective game, they were excellent. And that was the first time I thought that's a complete first half. And from there, I think they just got better and better and better. And there's a few little tweaks which show you savvy recruitment. João Pedro being able to break down a low block effectively being one thing. Liam Delap looking hungry and I think clinical another. And then naturally, we know that when you have a Moises Caicedo fit, the midfield is always going to be controlled. Reece James used in midfield, interesting experiment still. Let's see whether that goes into the new season or not. But generally, I think Chelsea in very good shape. And therefore, I wasn't surprised that they ended up beating PSG. People were referring to that final and fixture as a foregone conclusion because they'd watched PSG desecrate Real Madrid. But actually, Luis Enrique got outclassed tactically by Enzo Maresca. So there's a lot to like because you sort of feel like one more preseason under Enzo Maresca plus this recruitment actually equals Chelsea as a stable and cohesive unit. And some could say project now on and off the field. Club World Cup, I thought was fascinating. In many ways, I was quite glad to see Flamengo upset Chelsea, Botafogo beat PSG, Al Hilal knock out Manchester City, because it meant there was a point of difference to that and the Champions League. The tournament took some time to warm up. By the end of it, with the money at stake and the prestige, the games all meant something. Bit of a dress rehearsal for me as a journalist ahead of the World Cup too. Got to be honest, MetLife Stadium, not my absolute favorite out in New Jersey.
Not mine
Giant
either.
bowl, difficult to get in and out of, but it's huge. So there will be a good atmosphere. And then the last thing I'd say that people don't realize as a journalist is that we're inside, we're behind protected glass. And I know people will be like, oh, that means that you've got air conditioning and you've got your prawn sandwiches and you've got the sort of hospitality of the media, but it makes you feel a bit sterile. And I'm a little bit disappointed actually that in all these World Cup stadiums, with Atlanta being the only exception that I attended where you really felt a part of it, you weren't able to soak up the atmosphere in the same way. So sometimes I was looking at opposition fans like Widad, Al Ali, because I was covering not just Chelsea, but Manchester City in the opening game as well. And it was phenomenal. And walking into the stadium, the atmosphere, the different diversity of football cultures, is fascinating. And you really get sucked in. And then as a journalist, you go up to the gantry and you're inside and you miss a bit of the atmosphere. So that's a shame. And I hope it doesn't affect the journalist's perception of World Cups, because when you actually look outside the stadiums, the Flamengo fans being one great example, they turned it into a party and you could tell to them this tournament meant something even in those early stages. So for me, I think FIFA will be delighted with the first edition, even though naturally it came under a bit of criticism for things like weather, delays and early attendances during the event.
Indeed. And Chelsea end as champions, which is a very fun thing for us to brag about now for 4 years. But Look, Chelsea have been doing a lot of business, it seems, earlier in the transfer window compared to the last 3 seasons where they have crammed everything in the last like 3 days of
Mm.
the window, it seemed. And we're doing the same sort of special leading all the way up until the 1st of September. On Monday, just alone, 2 or 3 deals were announced. There's a lot more in the
Mm.
spanner. So let's just kind of quickly run through these. Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall, who's always been mooted for a move basically since the start of last season, to Everton for 28 million. Is that roughly the number?
Yeah, give or take. It's a little bit closer to 29, I'm told. In fact, it's 25.9 plus 4 million in add-ons, the exact number I've been given. So just a fraction below 30 million, which is good business for Chelsea.
Yep. So that one is done, and that was kind of long rumored to be a part of the outs. Leslie Gachukwu, I think, finds the midfield pretty crowded these days at Chelsea. Ends up at Burnley for reported 25. Are you hearing 25 as well?
Yeah, again, give or take, good money for him too. But as you say, crowded midfield. So I think that deal sort of suits all parties. And also,
Yeah.
Ugwachukwu knew that he was one of the players that they were looking to sell. So that's another very positive one for Chelsea, especially if you consider their A-list player registration for the Champions League and needing that
Mhm.
net positive balance. So that's why we're seeing this flurry of business and permanent exits.
Yep. And then a lot of reports that Borussia Dortmund are back in seriously for Carney Chukwuemeka, even though reports for the last year have been we could never be that serious about this at the price. Do you know what's happening there with the price? Is Chelsea come down or are they coming up?
Yeah, I think Chelsea have come down, and that's why the talks are advancing. They might even be termed advanced now. It depends what your definition of the word is. But in essence, it went from Chukwuemeka wanting to stay. I did an interview with Sebastian Kell at the Club World Cup where he said that they prefer a loan with a buy option. Chelsea were not prepared to entertain that at that point. Now we'll have to wait and see if it's a loan with an obligation or a permanent exit. But Chelsea are still pushing for permanence. And of course, the compromise here is you go from loan with a buy option saying no to sticking to something with permanence, but maybe bending either on price or structure. And I think if that number drops from about 40 million pounds to 35 or 40 million euros, Chelsea will sanction that. My understanding is Dortmund are trying more for 25 or 30 million euros. So there is a bit of a gulf in valuation, but Dortmund expect Chukwuemeka to join. They think he's waiting for them. And this idea that in the Xavi Simons talks, perhaps Chukwuemeka will be bartered in is not my understanding, not because the reports of conversations are wrong. Absolutely, Chelsea and Leipzig discussed it, but Chukwuemeka was not aware of that, nor was he approached directly. And then when he learnt of it a bit further down the line, he said, I only want Dortmund. So he's holding out for that return to Dortmund. And I would be surprised, even though there is still a gulf in valuation, if that deal doesn't get over the line.
I mean, he's an interesting profile, right? Because on paper, incredibly skillful,
Mm.
young player who's, of course, gone through his fair share of injuries, but incredibly highly rated. And yet, there doesn't seem to be a matching valuation historically for him in the market. Chelsea purchased him
Mm.
from Villa, which I think was kind of before we all knew about the PSR gamesmanship. It kind of felt like that was a part of their early buy up all the youth talent strategy. Do you find his profile to be of a 40 million pound sort of valuation, just given the insanity of the market? Or is
Yeah.
this Chelsea hedging, trying to hedge their bets the best that they possibly can because they purchased him for 20 and want to get some sort of return?
Yeah, I think it's an element of both. The market is inflated. There's plenty of players that are going for sort of in and around those type of numbers. If you look at another player that Dortmund are chasing, Fabio Silva, the asking price there is 25 million euros. You would expect Carney Chukwuemeka to be well above that. So add 10
Mhm.
million euros and you're at 35 million euros. And I think generally, if you think about Chelsea's model, there has to be a return on investment. But what you could say is if they loan him with wage coverage based upon last season, they get a little bit back. plus a saving. So you start adding everything up cumulatively. And that was their perspective also with the Joao Felix deal, that if you're getting 30 million up front, 20 million in add-ons, he's only got a 2-year contract. And as a consequence, there's a fair chance that still at a young age, he goes back to Europe. So after 2 years, you've got a much higher percentage chance of the player not extending and leaving. In 2 years' time, Ronaldo probably won't be a NASA player either. So it could be all changed. So when you do that deal, you go, okay, I got my 30, I've maybe got my 20, and then I've got a healthy sell-on clause. And Chelsea's model will always be looking at that flip aspect. It's not to say they ever sign a player as an asset that they just think is great value and they can flip. But they will know at times, in my opinion, that they've overstocked. And consequently, if healthy competition arises, eventually they'll have to develop 2 players in the same position that they think are both capable of being Chelsea long-term stars, and reluctantly, in some cases, decide that one needs to go. I don't think that they were desperately wanting Jordi Petrovic to leave. But what you find is that player that thinks they're almost there, or there's virtually nothing different between the 2 players, that isn't the one that gets the minutes, they start complicating your model and saying, I want to go because I think I can play week in, week out. Sometimes it benefits you. It happened with Cole Palmer. Man City didn't really want him to leave. Chelsea thought they could give him instant minutes. And look how that's worked out. I remember speaking to the late and wonderful Sven-Göran Eriksson when he was at Man City. And he told me at the time that he had 2 goalkeepers, and one of them was Joe Hart. The other was Kasper Schmeichel, and they were identical. And he literally couldn't decide who to pick. And he went with Joe Hart, homegrown, and there was zero difference in his mind. And then Kasper Schmeichel goes, okay, I want to go away. And you have to respect that. So I think some of this, same with Renato Vega, is about the player saying, I want minutes, I want to play every week. And then Chelsea's model then has to be contingent on finding a deal that suits all parties. And as you say, if Chukwuemeka was signed for 20, he's not going to be sold for 15 or 20, which means you have to start with about 30 million euros if we convert it back into the currency that Dortmund are actually dealing with. Then you want to make a bit of cream on top. And this is where the 40 million pounds number comes from. Maybe it gets done at 35 or 40 million euros, but not less. Otherwise, it's just not in Chelsea's interest to sell.
Right. And I guess follow-up question before we get into the rest of what is an extensive list that I have on our collective script here. Do you feel like, because I think your point is like Chelsea are, as we've spoken about before, Chelsea are making a lot of bets on a lot of young players. And they're also, I think, in the last season and a half, admitting when something isn't going to work or when they made the wrong bet on the wrong thing and they're failing fast, instead of the previous ownership group failing very slowly, right? 4 seasons on loan to try and get a value to where they really wanted it to be. This group is saying, all right, maybe this isn't the player that we actually needed. Let's try and move on as quickly as possible. Do you think that the learnings that are happening now will allow Chelsea to buy smarter in the future, i.e., not make as many Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall signings? Although I don't view him as a bad player. I just don't think it worked out in the way that they hoped. Is kind of my point.
Yeah, I think generally the recruitment has these parallel goals. One, to go after all the best young talent and have a rich history of developing them and, if needed, selling them. And then the other aspect is bringing in flagship players that are Chelsea starters, still traditionally quite young, but I don't think that model is so rigid that they won't make exceptions, which is why they tried for Virgil van Dijk, albeit speculatively, knowing that there might be a brief window of opportunity before he renewed at Liverpool. So I wouldn't put down a lot of the Chelsea signings into a column of success or failure. I think it's just a case of the more you bring in and develop and improve, the better chance each of them have got of success. But what people don't realize when they understand this Chelsea model is if you take your standard academy model, which is lots of players coming through and everyone accepting that maybe only 5 or 10% of them work, no one would really have an issue with that, because academies end up having more outgoings than people that make the step up and become regular first teamers. And that's just the nature of odds and football, and the fact that you're stepping up to staggered age groups. So even if you're good enough at the age of 18, you
Yeah.
might suddenly have a 23-year-old, a 27-year-old, and a 31-year-old ahead of you, all in the same positions, and you may not be prepared to wait. And believe it or not, actually, some of those academy outgoings or young player outgoings are also down to the fact that that player might look at that pathway and say, I'm ready now. And then, as with Man City and Cole Palmer, the club has got a decision to make. Where Chelsea is complicated is they're almost taking that model and putting it at the lower age bracket of their first team. So the same overstocking and the same academy mentality is actually happening on the cusp of the first team. So not academy so much as under 23s or first team, which is why we're seeing a lot of debuts from the academy, with Reggie Walsh being one example.
Mhm.
We're seeing a player like Tyreek George be given opportunities, but now maybe he's allowed to leave somewhere permanently. So you're seeing what traditionally in football in a younger age group plays out privately, and you don't know about the ones that don't make it. And everyone that makes it becomes a sort of Cobham superstar that everyone gets behind. But now you're sort of seeing it play out at first team level, where Chukwuemeka had a few minutes and then went to Dortmund. Amari Kellyman's come in. Okay, he's injured, but he'll go to the Championship. He'll come back. Alfie Gilchrist played a bit for Chelsea and definitely got the fan base on side, but then went on loan to Sheffield United. He's expected to leave. So everything's sort of shifted. And of course, when you shift it, the valuation of the players raises because they're actually putting on the Chelsea shirt at professional first team level. But it means you see the overstocking play out firsthand with bit part roles in minutes for a higher volume of younger players than at other clubs that maybe would still be resigned to under 23 or under 21s or just academy players in their late teens. Then all of that pathway allows the players to get better and gain experience. And at some point, you then realize we now have to pick between the eithers and the ors. And this is where, for example, Bournemouth will make an inquiry over Josh Anchimpong and say, we know Chelsea like him. We know he just signed a new deal. We know Enzo Maresca thinks he could be the next big thing across the defence. But is there actually a way of pulling him now and offering him that immediate guaranteed week-on-week game time? At which point, Chelsea have these two considerations. One, blue code Chelsea, what's best for the football club, the primary consideration. And two, this inclination to be more like Red Bull and say, okay, if we accept this player's great, but we've got other options. If a certain valuation is hit, we actually are a selling club as long as we don't think it's detrimental to actual Chelsea Football Club success. So you've got two models at play and a shifting of traditional academy mentality towards recruitment put at the lower age bracket end of the first team, which means it's all playing out in public a bit more. And that's why I think it feels like Chelsea have got such a lot of high turnover. And I don't expect that to stop, because actually I think this model is contingent upon not necessarily a Dewsbury-Hall who was more established, but keep bringing in players, keep giving them opportunities, keep having them raise their value, and then seeing whether somewhere down the line you either get them to the point where they're sellable assets or their experience allows them to be fantastic players for Chelsea. And that isn't happening behind closed doors, which is what for me makes this model so fascinating.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I was actually going to cover the Cobham conundrum next, but I think just because you brought up Josh and kind of the dueling ideology here, I think I want to bring it up now. So Josh, Ty, there's been kind of a little bit of news around what will happen with them in their future. They
Mm,
were the kind of the next two academy players brought up. You know, Trev, Levi, and Reece James are the academy players currently at the club that kind of have that tie to Cobham. Ty, I think is going to find himself potentially crowded out because
mm.
of signings that are potentially in that we'll talk about in the next section. And I think there's a sense, at least my Twitter mentions would tell you, all right, see ya, Ty. Don't worry about it. As long as there's a sell on fee or a buyback clause, it doesn't really matter. He needs to go play. And
Mm.
then there are some folks who are like, no, he needs to get a loan if you truly believe in this player. And I'm not in the room. I don't know if they truly believe in Ty or not. I think it seems odd that they would have brought him and Josh through in such a ceremonious way if they didn't. But I don't know. If you truly believe in him, then you would give him a loan and see what you actually have before you try and
Yeah.
sell him. Do you feel like in the current, dueling structure that you just mentioned that Cobham is going to just kind of go by the wayside in a way for Pathway?
No, because it's that sort of lost generation, if we can call it that, that maybe we've discussed. And by lost generation, I mean if you were 16 to 18 when this ownership took over, you were part of an academy or youth system before this ownership decided what they were going to do. Then they put heavy investment into that age category. And as a consequence, you had a lot of overlap between players on the cusp of maybe getting a first team opportunity and new players coming in the same age group. Now they've stocked themselves up with a range of players in the, let's just call it 18 to 22-year-old age bracket. And I think they were the youngest average Premier League starting 11. I think you almost revert back, which is why first team recruitment might slow down to a kind of 12 to 16 age group. And you start saying, instead of always having to sign the next big 17, 18-year-old, how can we actually already own that 17, 18-year-old and have had them at the football club for 3, 4, 5 years or however long? So if anything, they're quite happy now with the 18 to 22 and the 22 to 25 age brackets. And that's the sort of two staggerings. And then if you go back to an age group younger than that, you start more discreetly going into an age group that will only start in the academy. And maybe these signings get celebrated a little bit at the time as the next big things because that's the nature of social media. But you might not hear about that 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old for 3, 4, 5, 6 years. So I don't think they'll always be after 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds. I think once they've stocked in that area and they don't feel far off because they've got two young goalkeepers, they've got two young fullbacks now because Joel Hatto has arrived and Josan Chimpong is there and he's versatile and can play across the defence. Levi Colwell, I believe, is still under the age of 23. You look in the midfield, all still pretty young in the centre of the park and definitely very young in wide areas. And now Liam Delap, Joao Pedro. So they're quite well covered in that age bracket. Then if you take a skip back, they have made a big push to move for 18, 19, 20-year-olds, with Joel Hatto being one of them. Jesse Derry is another who signed a contract until 2029 and was very highly rated as a schoolboy by Crystal Palace. So I actually think what you'll see is this model shift to that sort of, let's just call it 12 to 16-year-old age bracket, not shout and scream about it. Less will be in the public domain. And then we'll start to once again circle back to how it was under Roman Abramovich, where maybe out of nowhere, you suddenly realize that somebody's developed fast and they've gone from sort of 12 unheard of to 14 start to speak about, maybe bumped up a few age groups. And then finally, when they get 16, 17, 18, you're like, wow, okay, they are the next big thing. But instead of it being Esteval Willian arrives today, first team, it's actually they've been at Cobham for 4 or 5 years. And that's the priority because then you've got full control over their development. And as with Kendry Paez, you've got the opportunity to factor in Strasbourg into the mix to get the minutes at a very early age.
So the scouting less on 17, 18, 19, 20, all the way through like 22 to earlier. Cobham still remains a critical piece of this puzzle. And it could just be that this lost generation has a few less promoted graduates because of the profiles that have been signed than maybe what, those of us who believe in the academy would like to see, but potentially in the future, it becomes a stronger pathway. Is that
Yeah,
accurate?
and also just briefly on that, the pathway is always twofold. So I come back to what I said before, that when a player of that age group, which is very atypical, hence why Chelsea's average starting 11 is young, when a player of that age ends up getting first team minutes at most clubs, people think they have broken through. Whereas when they break through to Chelsea's first team at that age, there's heavy competition. So there is still a chance, as we've seen with several players. Leslie Okwuchukwu is another example, that they get sold relatively quickly. So the difference between now and Abramovich is that getting that first team opportunity isn't a guarantee that you've definitively made it. It may be a guarantee that you get opportunities and then you're still sold very quickly because there's a lot of heavy competition. And this isn't heavy competition with an 18-year-old and a 27-year-old. This is heavy competition where an 18-year-old might have a 21-year-old, a 24-year-old, and a 27-year-old all above them. And as a result, you
Right.
have to make that determination. So it's just shifting. Instead of saying at academy level, we accept there's a high turnover, and at first team level, there's less of a turnover, Chelsea are actually prepared to have a grey area between an academy graduate and someone on the periphery of the first team, give them an earlier opportunity,
Hmm.
develop them, back them to make it. But if they don't, say they're actually suddenly very experienced for their age because they're not a 18-year-old, 19-year-old that's only played one League Cup tie for a Premier League team. Maybe they've had 10, 12 opportunities. Maybe they've had a year training with the first team. And all of that adds to the value. And the challenge is obviously that in that development and surrounded by Chelsea players and first team squad, some of these young players go, I think I'm actually better than other people around me. I think I actually deserve minutes elsewhere. I think I actually want to make a move now. So there will be the odd scenario, I think, not as you put it, where a Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall comes, doesn't get enough opportunities and leaves, and everyone thinks that was a bit predictable from day one. It was always going to happen. There probably will be an inverse scenario where there's actually an incredible talent that begrudgingly Chelsea go, we're going to let you leave, maybe with a buyback. And then perhaps like Cole Palmer, you suddenly see that talent set the world on fire. And it sort of justifies Chelsea's model. But of course, fans will go, why didn't we keep hold of them in the first place? So I can foresee a few of those scenarios too, where some young players leave because it suits all parties and go and be amazing elsewhere. But that's just football. I mean, even before this ownership came in, it happened with Tino Livramento. And I think there's plenty of people now at Chelsea that would love Tino Livramento back, that might love Lewis Hall back as well. So it's the
Rio
nature of
Namoa
football in
at
big clubs.
Liverpool, right, as is like the shining example of the one
Yeah.
that might get away again. There's a lot that could kind of come into play there for sure. Like, I guess Ty in particular, do you think that Ty will leave on loan or on permanent this year?
I think Chelsea's preference is not a permanent exit, but the players looking for first team opportunities, which means if he finds a permanent exit, Chelsea will sanction that sale. So I do think there's a realistic chance that it's a permanent exit. And obviously, we know in short what Chelsea's moves are. They're trying to get Xavi Simons over the line. And then the expectation is they'll make an approach for Alejandro Garnacho. And my understanding is there's already been some formal talks there anyway. So this won't be a deal that Chelsea go into blindly. They've done some legwork on Garnacho. So if you look at the left and the right, on the left-hand side, you've got Jamie Gittins, Giovanni Quenda arrives in a year's time. So even with Mikhailo Mudryk unavailable and Jadon Sancho being sent back to Manchester United, if you add the fact that Pedro Neto can switch sides too, there's plenty of options there on the left-hand side. And if Cole Palmer's playing as 10, even Xavi Simons can filter over to either the left or the right. So Tyreek George is probably looking at that lineup and wondering how many opportunities he's going to get. And this is where maybe an exit will suit all sides. He's been discussed by Leipzig, Eintracht Frankfurt. In fact, there's quite a lot of interest in Germany. And I think there'll be Premier League interest in him as well, because clubs will realise, like I said before, that this is not a player that's not up to the Chelsea standard. It's just that there's so much competition. It might be in all parties' interest should Garnacho arrive for Tyreek George to leave permanently. Chelsea would be fine having him as a squad player. Why I think the player is thinking about a permanent exit now is because squad player may suit all parties for 12 months. But when Tyreek George looks at Quenda arriving as well, he may think he's going to be in exactly the same position in another year's time. So if the right opportunity presents itself now, I don't think Chelsea will stand in his way. And it's going to be fascinating, really, because Jamie Gittins will feel that he's been brought in as a starter. Garnacho's not going to join Chelsea without backing himself to be a starter. If Esteval Willian sets the world alight on the right,
I
then
know.
because Cole Palmer's the 10, it could be Esteval on the right. And then I think Pedro Neto was just about Chelsea's best player at the Club World Cup. So who's to say if Esteval breaks through on the right that Neto won't end up being the starter on the left? So you've got a fascinating situation. And ultimately, whatever permutations you spell out and whatever balance you think about, they've got so much versatility there that I think the expectation with Tyreek George will be that his minutes will be stifled because he will know that Alejandro Garnacho is likely on the way.
One too many, maybe, in terms of competition. Do you anticipate Josh will stay at Chelsea this year? Or is he potentially on the outs as well?
I think Josh Anchimpong is more complicated because Chelsea really value him and they genuinely think that he's not too far off being a serious player for this football club. There's obviously other options though, so part of it will be on the player. But Bournemouth already made an inquiry, to my knowledge, and said they were very serious about making a bid. And it was shut down, I think, about 2 weeks ago by Chelsea. So at this stage, I don't have the same information about a Josh exit. But what I would say is that there's probably only 4, 5 players in this entire Chelsea squad that are 100% unsellable at this point. I think you would have to say Cole Palmer. You would definitely say Moises Caicedo. You would obviously say all of the new signings. You would probably say Romeo Lavia and Enzo Fernandez, even though if somebody wanted to give Chelsea a British transfer record for Enzo Fernandez, you can never say never, but I think it's highly, highly unlikely. And there's very few others. Pedro Neto, because of his form at the moment. But when you sort of look at any other young player at the club or any slightly older player at the club, there is a number there. But some of the reason why there's a number there is because there's so much concurrence between the business of outgoings they're looking to do, because they have to scramble a bit to get that net positive balance to make sure they can register all of their A-list players for the Champions League. So if you look at day one of outgoings, there's only that 4 or 5 that are not available. Once you get 1 or 2 outgoings, they start to go, well, with Chilwell and Sterling and Disasi, these 3 or 4 that were 10% chance of being sold become 1% chance of being sold. So as all these outgoings happen, the slim chances that were always slim to begin with of a Josh Anchimpong exit become slimmer and slimmer and slimmer and slimmer. And I don't usually like to put percentages on it, but I would say day one of the window, if they desperately needed outgoings, there was no more than a 10% chance that they would engage over Josh Anchimpong. Now I think it's 1 or 2% likely if anyone comes calling, because we've already had the flurry of outgoings. So I think he'll stay, but it's not impossible that Bournemouth return with some interest, because they did make an inquiry only 2 weeks ago.
Interesting. Okay. I guess on to the rest of the sales, because we're kind of in deal bonanza mode. Lots going on with now Nicolas Jackson as of this morning. And of course, we're recording this on August 5th in the morning US and the afternoon UK time. Lots of movement on Shesko, which is, Newcastle and Manchester United kind of dueling for the same player. And the impacts, that you and Ornstein and others are reporting that Jackson is not a lock to stay at Chelsea this summer continue. I guess one, odds that he leaves versus odds that he stays.
I think Jackson is more likely to leave. And I don't even think that Chelsea need another target to come in a defined number 9. There was some suggestion at the beginning of the window that they also like Benjamin Sesko. As soon as Liam Delap arrived, it was said to me that Sesko was too similar to Jackson and Delap. So I understand why fans will say if Jackson goes, there might be another number 9 coming in. But I think it's the opposite, that the original plan was that João Pedro was signed as a replacement for Christopher Nkunku. Now Xavi Simons is coming in, and he's a little bit Christopher Nkunku in the sense that Nkunku's favoured position is attacking midfield, second striker, behind a number 9, whatever. So now I think what's happening is a shift where when we interviewed João Pedro, we were told very clearly by the player he sees himself as a number 9. When we asked the same question to Enzo Maresca, he said he's versatile and he can play anywhere across the front line or out wide. So I sense what would happen if Jackson leaves is that João Pedro would be shifted into a 9 to compete with Liam Delap. Xavi Simons, Cole Palmer, maybe even Esteval in the centre behind the striker. Pedro Neto on the right, but could be switched to the left because you never know. Esteval might start on the right, as I raised before. So you've got a few moving parts here. But I think the feeling is within Chelsea that 1, Nicolas Jackson wants to start week in, week out. And 2, Chelsea are prepared to entertain a sale. So it is looking more likely than not that Jackson will go, but it's not necessarily contingent on a number 9 coming in. I think if the window's shut and they had Xavi Simons, Alejandro Garnacho, and then João Pedro and Liam Delap as their 9s, Chelsea would be relatively content with their front line. Where might Jackson go? Premier League is one possibility. Milan is another, but the price would have to drop. Jackson has been offered to Newcastle United at the time we're live, and this may date very quickly. We've just heard news of a new Manchester United offer for Benjamin Sesko, their first formal one. So now Newcastle and Man United are both quite close to agreeing a deal with Leipzig. And the expectation at this stage is that Sesko is leaning towards Manchester United. So could there be a possibility where Jackson gets pushed to Newcastle if they don't get Sesko? Similarly, if Chelsea come to the table for Garnacho and Sesko goes to Newcastle, then maybe there's a new conversation to be had about Nicolas Jackson as well. And this is why I think Chelsea realise as striker dominoes fall, there's going to be clubs that are left short. Someone could come in for Ollie Watkins even, and then Villa may come in for Nicolas Jackson. So there's enough Premier League interest. Now, not every club has had Jackson as their number one target or the one that they've wanted to do early in the window. Later in the window, there may be some more urgency and Jackson may be spoken about or bid for by these clubs. And this is why I think Chelsea think there'll be more than one suitor for Nicolas Jackson in the month of August. And there remains a likelihood he will be sold. I think the other factor in this is price. So when Manchester United first inquired about Nicolas Jackson earlier in the window, they were told 80 million. I sense that number will drop in the last 4 weeks of the window. And if it does, Newcastle have just bid nearly 90 million for Benjamin Sesko. Manchester United have bid 85 million for Benjamin Sesko. If Ollie Watkins leaves Villa, they're asking for 60 million. That's about 70 million euros. So you would have three clubs potentially, depending on how the dominoes fall, that two have shown their hand and one might get a big influx of money if they go against what is their current stance and decide to sell Ollie Watkins. I think Chelsea are just waiting for that because they know these clubs, particularly Man United or Newcastle, will have a big chunk of money and one of them is going to leave empty-handed in the Sesko saga. And that's where it might end up suiting Jackson and suiting Chelsea and suiting one of those clubs to try and get a deal over the line. So keep an eye on the Jackson situation because there remains a realistic chance that he's gone before this window is out. And obviously the same, if not more so, is the case for Christopher Nkunku as well.
Why would the price drop when you have a number of clubs who are playing, hot potato essentially with their striker options, and the market has been pretty clearly set for a striker? I mean, I'm not telling you that Nicolas Jackson is Isak, of course. I don't think that that's the case. But if you're telling me that roughly 55% of Isak's desired fee at 150 million is Nicolas Jackson, then I'm buying that all day. Why would the fee drop when other clubs are in need? That would seem counterintuitive to me.
Yeah, I think because when you spell it out, it suggests a bidding war, but actually they'll probably be left with one of the clubs in this merry-go-round that doesn't get Sesko, that considers Jackson. We can't say categorically that Ollie Watkins will leave Aston Villa. So there might only be one club coming to Chelsea late in the window, knowing that time is running out and maybe the player wants a move. And as a result, the buyer gains a bit of ascendancy later in the window, whereas earlier in the window, the seller tends to have all of the cards. So that's partially why buyers, if Chelsea really want to sell in the end and cash it, and may be able to go a bit lower than that 80 million number. It might not drop. Obviously, we have to pay respect to Chelsea sources who actually have given a sliding scale and have intimated that Nicolas Jackson is 80 million at the lowest and might even be closer to 100 million. But in essence, it comes back to what we said about Chukwuemeka, that if clubs keep a player for a short, and that's the key word, period of time, if they're presented across 1 year, 2 years with the opportunity to double up or get just over, that tends to be acceptable. So Chelsea turn a profit on Noni Madueke, Chelsea looking for double their money on Carney Chukwuemeka, Chelsea making a profit on Leslie Ukwuchukwu. It's only really your sort of Kiernan Dewsbury-Halls when the player's a bit older that you say, okay, if over the period that they were there, we get our money back, we're okay. So I think the overall package for Nicolas Jackson was somewhere in the region of £32 million. So if you
Yes.
double that at 64, then you look at an inflated market where Brian and Mbumo is 71, you're probably saying, if we get Mbumo type money, that's a satisfiable situation. It's a bit different because Mbumo was 71 million with a year plus a 1 year option left on his contract. He's older, but you could argue he was more consistent than Nicolas Jackson last season.
Yeah.
But I think that's how they'll be looking at it. And that's also how the prospective buyers will be also approaching the situation. It's one thing saying he's worth 80 million. I'm sure you can use stats and data, but the flip side is if the market's going to walk away to other targets, then you get zero, and then you can live with it with the player because Enzo Maresca values him. But you present a different scenario in the dressing room where maybe he's unhappy because he's going to get less game time. So I actually think what will happen with Jackson, it's just an opinion, is whatever Darwin Nunez goes for, whether to Saudi Arabia or Milan or elsewhere, that might be used as a yardstick for valuation. And if Liverpool get 70 million, maybe that means that Jackson goes for 70 million. If Liverpool are able to push that closer to the 85 million that they bought Darwin Nunez for, then maybe Chelsea stick to a much higher valuation. But I think anything above 70 million for Nicolas Jackson might stand a chance because it's more than double what Chelsea paid.
You mentioned Nkunku as well. I mean, this was kind of the one when I talked to Matt a couple weeks ago, where it's like we obviously are going to have a logjam, as you mentioned. Like if Nkunku's still at the club and potentially Xavi Simons comes in, and you have all these versatile forwards, as our club has now deemed them all to be, they all kind of play in the same spot. What is the market for Christopher Nkunku in all this kind of madness?
Yeah, I think with Christopher Nkunku, it's different because he falls into that Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall category where Chelsea are probably happy to make pretty much what they paid, if not less now. The asking price in January, when Chelsea liked the idea of Matis Tel now at Spurs, was 60 million for Nkunku. It didn't come off. It was too high for Bayern. It'll be lower, in my opinion, than 60 million now. Some could argue he got in the shop window at the Club World Cup and did okay. So that protects the value a little bit. But I think Chelsea will be happy to find a solution for Christopher Nkunku. It wouldn't even surprise me if they're prepared to entertain something a bit more flexible now. Not necessarily a loan with a buy option, but it's not 100% discounted, but maybe a loan with an obligation to buy, allowing a potential buyer a slightly more preferable structure. And as a consequence, I think Chelsea are working with Nkunku to find him options, and I don't expect them to stand in his way. Bayern could be back, even though they've got Luis Diaz on the left-hand side. They're still looking for a more central attacker, and Nkunku is on their radar, but it will all be dependent on Chelsea and how low they're prepared to go with the price. Because when Bayern Munich were looking at Christopher Nkunku in January and Chelsea was saying £60 million, Bayern's valuation was closer to 40 million. So there was quite a big gulf in valuation. And because Nkunku appears out of the project and more time has come off his contract, I think Bayern would be relatively firm in sticking to that asking price. Manchester United have been mentioned in the past as well. It's true at the beginning of the window, they quite like the player, but he's the wrong kind of profile now, unless they decided to U-turn and say he's a number 9 and Benjamin Sesko was not to arrive. But obviously, if they want someone that plays behind the striker, they got Cunha, they got Mbumo, they got Mount, they got Bruno Fernandes. So not really looking to strengthen anymore in that area, whereas they were before the arrival of both Cunha and Mbumo. So I think Manchester United are out the race for Christopher Nkunku, but Bayern could still be there.
Raheem Sterling, arguably the toughest of all of them to move, just wages and kind of where his performance has been. Fulham?
Yeah, Raheem Sterling, tough one because the player has been out of the project for so long, and yet with Arsenal, it was a late window deal, very much on Arsenal's terms, where Chelsea paid a large portion of the wages. Arsenal got a player that Mikel Arteta knew. He was always there as a squad player. Didn't really work out in the way that Sterling would have hoped. But by the same token, I don't think Arsenal ever really had the intent to make that move permanently. So now Sterling is looking for options. There's some suggestion of Leverkusen, but Leverkusen sources, despite acknowledging the interest, say they've moved on in a different direction now. Juventus for another club that have looked. Fulham made an inquiry too. Everton could come into the mix as well.
Hmm.
Everton were pushing for Tyler Dibbling first and foremost as their main sort of attacker who's on the right side. But they are looking to strengthen on the left as well, as evidenced by the fact that their top choice to do a short-term loan is Jack Grealish. And if Manchester City cave on their demands of a permanent exit for Jack Grealish and become open to a loan, then Everton will be there. And I think Grealish is their top priority on that left-hand side if they can get an experienced player on their terms. But it has to be a loan for Everton. And I think it's the same for Raheem Sterling as well. If he doesn't find a solution, if Grealish doesn't come off, Everton have also discussed Raheem Sterling as a possibility, but because of the wage, it would have to be a loan, possibly with a buy option. So we'll see whether Chelsea accept that or whether they're hoping for the opposite, that they can lower the asking price for Sterling and then somebody will come and take his wage off their books. There is Saudi interest in Sterling as well. I've never been led to believe that he's keen on that project. I think it's the same Saudi central deal makers that were there a year's time, basically saying to Sterling, if you want the move, same money as a year ago, and then we'll allocate you a club depending on the needs of the different teams. And Sterling has basically said he's not making a money conscious decision. He may want to stay within the Premier League, which could give some hope if they choose to advance things with either Fulham or Everton. But for now, it's all quiet on the Sterling front. And the suggestion that he's kind of been in a bomb squad recently, it's not strictly true to my understanding. He's been training with the kind of loan squad or bomb squad, whatever you want to call it. Not all these players are surplus to requirements. Some of them are young players that Chelsea either were going to loan to Strasbourg or loan out elsewhere. And Sterling was part of that group. And this wasn't a Monday back to training, you're in the bomb squad. He's been training with that group for the last 3 weeks and very professionally from what I'm told as well. So come the end of the window, they'll find a solution for him. But where he goes next is still, at the time we're live anyway, not entirely clear.
Vega's moved to Atletico Madrid, goes by the wayside.
Yeah.
Obviously, kind of weird circumstances around that one. Does he get the move that he wants before the end of the window? Maybe.
I think he goes, and he has to go because he wants to play centre-back in a World Cup year. So there's urgency on the player side. It's not like some other scenarios of players that might be prepared to stay and wait for opportunities or be squad players. Vega's made it really clear to Chelsea that he wants to go be a centre-back. That's his best chance of making the World Cup and getting regular minutes at that tournament. You had Atleti, as you say. The deal didn't come off. Vega was all in. He was sold on that move, a bit like other players in the past when they've thought, okay, this deal's going to happen. He'd very much put all of his eggs in the Atletico Madrid basket, actually, like Darwin Núñez away from Chelsea did for Napoli. Move didn't come off. So now he's having to reassess. There is a possibility, I'm told, that Saudi come calling also for Renato Vega. And there were some informal conversations with Al Nassr that took place when João Felix ended up making that surprise move in the end over Benfica, because during the Club World Cup, we thought that Felix was all in on Benfica. Then Cristiano Ronaldo running the show to some extent, and it all changed very quickly. So if Vega opens the door to Saudi, he does have a possibility there, but I think he's trying to explore the market first for other opportunities in a Big Five league, and it's very much the player taking his time. There's a deal there to be had with Chelsea. Club-to-club negotiation will not be a problem, especially now Joral Hato has arrived, because they've got that young left-back and a bit of a Swiss Army knife, so they can sell Renato Vega, but it's very much the player delaying as he assesses his options, because he really didn't do that to any great degree prior to the possibility of Atletico Madrid, because they thought that was advanced and going to happen.
And then old Chilwell, unfortunately, just I think struggling to find the next move. Any news on him, or is it still pretty much status quo?
Yeah, nothing yet on Ben Chilwell. Crystal Palace haven't come back in. There were some suggestions of Everton and West Ham. Certainly some substance to the West Ham side from what I was told, but it's not developed. And a lot of these clubs have moved on to either younger targets or ones with significantly less wages. So I think he falls into the same category as Raheem Sterling, highly professional, clearly not part of the project, needs to find a solution, and maybe even more urgently than Sterling. I mean, in fairness, Sterling may argue if Jordan Henderson can get an England call-up, why, if he has a good season, can't he be in the England setup? But he's definitely not been given the same encouragement as Ben Chilwell. Chilwell, as strange as it sounds, has been told by Thomas Tuchel, go and find a move, play every week. And he loves him. So
Yeah.
there could genuinely be a scenario where Ben Chilwell is vitally important to England, even though he's been discarded by Chelsea because he's not seen as the right kind of left back that they're looking for. So a solution's going to be found. I think Chelsea will be quite flexible on Chilwell as well. Of course, they want a permanent exit, but if it gets to the last sort of week or 10 days of the window and Chilwell still doesn't have a permanent solution, I think if there is a loan with a buy option type offer, I think Chelsea will understand that Chilwell needs to play, even if it's on a temporary move. And if he does so, as I said before, it could massively boost his chances of being on that plane for the World Cup.
Do you think that is in England or do you think it is abroad at this point?
Hard to tell. I think Chilwell's open to all options. Most of the inquiries, as we saw from the Crystal Palace loan, were in the Premier League, but I wouldn't rule out some interest from other leagues. There has been some early and formative inquiries from Turkey. Whether he'll go there, let's see. Italy as well. A few clubs there have made approaches, I'm told, but more in the kind of May and June months. So he's got a few formative approaches, but ultimately it's once again about agreeing terms with Chilwell, especially if it's to be a permanent exit, not so much about finding a solution with Chelsea, because Chelsea are adamant they want the Sterling and the Chilwell wages off the books. And when a club wants the wages off the books, it often means that they'll actually give the buying club a pretty good deal on fee. And that was
Right.
arguably the case with Joao Felix. I know it looks good for Chelsea if you add it all up, because it's 30 million euros, 20 million in add-ons. If he only stays 2 years, he's going to be sold again. Chelsea get a sell-on fee. But if you look at it from Al Nassr's point of view, they're probably thinking it's 30 million euros for a player that might be worth 40 or 50 million euros. And we don't have to pay these add-ons unless we win X, Y, or Z. And as a consequence, it suits all parties. So I don't think there'll be any roadblock dealing with Chelsea for either Sterling or Chilwell. I think the price will drop low enough to make the club to club fine. It's just about whether you can agree a deal with the player. It reminds me of Jadon Sancho as well. Manchester United are out there offering Sancho for just £17 million. That is 8 million less than Chelsea's top end of the obligation to buy. That's a really good deal. Plenty of clubs want to pay that, but you've got to be able to afford Sancho's wages as well.
Yep. And agents typically don't want to reduce their clients' wages. That is for sure. Just a quick note on loan spots, because I know loans are going to become a crucial part to the end of the window, as they always are. You already mentioned a couple of potential loan scenarios. Currently, if my math is sitting correctly, although I'm not sure if Kenda is technically a loan or if he's not been purchased officially yet, and that purchase goes in next year.
Mm.
Do you know for him, has the purchase gone through and he's been loaned back
Yeah, Quenda's a pre-agreement, so that was the term of the deal. So it will happen next year, so it won't
next
take
year?
up a loan spot.
Okay,
You then have the possibility of Tyreek George, although, as we said before, could be
maybe.
permanent as well. So that might not take up a loan spot. They filled their Strasbourg loans. Kendry Paez was the last one there over the line. So I think they feel in quite good shape. And then naturally, some players that were loaned last season that were taking up loan spots, Alfie Gilchrist, for example, likely to be a permanent exit. I think we'll see movement on Alfie Gilchrist this week or early next week, likely with a move to the Championship. So I don't think they're sweating too much about the loan spots. I think they feel they've cleared the decks quite well and they've done most of their loan business already, which means that they'll feel in quite good shape. Whereas perhaps a year ago it was a different situation, and maybe they felt then that they were having to really move different things around in order to clear up the space they needed to make the loans that they wanted to do.
Yeah, right now it looks like 4 of the 6 international spots are taken up. The 3 to Strasbourg. David Washington is at Santos. Obviously, we forget about him. Domestic loans: Wiley to Watford, Sharman Lowe to Bolton, Castledine to Huddersfield, Guiu to Sunderland last week. Looks like a bunch could go. Maybe Keanu Dyer to Coventry. Sounds like there could be a little
Yeah,
pathway
I've
there.
heard a little bit about that as well. So that is also a possibility.
All right, Ben, do you think that there's still something to do at goalkeeper for Chelsea, even though the market seems kind of odd? I mean, there are Donnarumma rumors out there, but it seems very unlikely, right?
You never know with Chelsea because they obviously showed their hand a little bit by trying for Mike Maignan, but then Rob Sanchez was the best goalkeeper at the Club World Cup. So it feels like their focus is on Javi Simons agreeing a fee. Can they get that for 70 million euros or under? And then a player, Alejandro Garnacho. That's the direction of travel. Robert Sanchez remains the number one. Philip Jorgensen, they feel, will improve season on season. And Mike Penders, I'm told, is deemed to be really spoken about as a kind of generational talent, almost in many ways, like people are hyping up Esteval Willian. And because you don't see goalkeepers as much, especially young ones, having the opportunity to actually watch how he fares at Strasbourg will be a clear indication of what might be next for Penders, because I suspect after that year at Strasbourg, he might be a genuine contender for regular Chelsea minutes. And this is why I think they're conscious not just to look at the number one situation through the prism of Rob Sanchez, but to understand if they bring in a goalkeeper 27, 28, I think Donnarumma's only 26, is that goalkeeper, even if they fare well, going to stifle the pathway of all of the others? Or are they actually prepared to stick with Robert Sanchez for at least one more season and then gain the benefit of that extra year to both Philip Jorgensen and Mike Penders? So that's where we're kind of at the moment. A lot of people asking me about three goalkeepers. One, Emi Martinez, downplayed by Chelsea sources that they might make an approach. Two, Donnarumma. Nobody's made an approach at this point. We hear rumours about Man United and also about Galatasaray, but the player might, just stay at PSG and see out his contract. And then there'll be a mad race because he'd be a free transfer. Whereas a bit like Mike Maignan, the third name that people always ask, Donnarumma is viewed as someone even with a year left that's £30 million or more, simply because of the fact that he's one of the best goalkeepers in the world. But for 1 year left on the contract, not so sure that they'll necessarily be takers. And that's the bottom end of the price. It could even be as high as £40 million. So this is a consideration for anyone on Donnarumma, the price that PSG want versus the fact the player may compete with the incoming Lucas Chevalier and leave in 12 months' time. So let's sort of see how that develops, because there will be interest in Donnarumma, even though the price is a bit of a stumbling block. And then obviously with Mike Maignan, we know it's the goalkeeper that Chelsea wanted. We know it's the one they tried for the Club World Cup. Nothing new, nothing reignited at this stage. But you can never say never, obviously, because what would happen if somewhere between now and the end of the window, 25 million goes to 12 million? I don't think Milan are going to budge on price. I actually think they see value in gambling on one more season, Maignan helping them get back into European football, and then trying to persuade him to sign a new deal. And this is where I think there's a point of difference between Donnarumma and Maignan, because with Donnarumma, PSG are not going to offer him a new deal because Lucas Chevalier is coming in. With Milan, they love Maignan. And therefore, if they gamble on keeping him, if no one meets their 25 million valuation, maybe they can change his mind if next season goes according to plan and is more positive than last campaign. And I think Chelsea know that the Milan price isn't going to drop significantly. And that's why I suspect that they might just leave it as is, with Rob Sanchez as the number one, and then Philip Jorgensen number two. And then the unanswered question is who's going to be the number three, because Bettinelli's departed. And that's the part of the puzzle that I don't yet have an answer to.
Is there just a chance that Chelsea and Milan do a deal this weekend when they play?
You never know. You can honestly never say never, because Maignan...
Just leave him at the bridge right after the game.
I mean Maignan was keen on the move. That's the thing. He was really pushing to leave. So we can't categorically discount it. But what we can say is at the time we're live, there's been no push to that. There's been no conversation over that. As you say, the clubs are going to meet each other. So in theory, they're in a room together. But at the moment, at the time we're actually recording this, they've not held a new meeting after deciding they weren't going to do it before the Club World Cup. So let's wait and see how it develops. It's Chelsea. There can always be a twist.
That's the perfect way to end this episode. Thank you for joining, Ben, and kind of talking through kind of the dueling club philosophy. I thought that was super interesting. All of the deal bonanzas that are going on right now as we kind of approach the last 3 weeks of the transfer window. And of course, we're a week away essentially from the season starting. It has bonkersville over here. So we're getting close, but just want to say thanks again for joining. Everyone, go follow Ben and give him your thanks as well. And we have plenty of content coming up, Chelsea fans. We have a preseason preview coming up. We have a Leverkusen review. We have a Milan review. We have a scouting special whenever those incoming deals get done. So content up to your eyeballs. But until next time, you know what to do. Keep the blue flag flying high.